"You're lacking a bit of spark," my wife told me as she strolled into my office. She wasn't alone. She had this young guy in tow that she introduced as some kind of lifestyle coach. I could see she thought she'd found an easy target in me, but I decided right then to offer that kid a deal he'd be a fool to turn down. His name was Julian. He was 29, had hands that had never seen a day of hard labor, and was wearing shoes that cost more than a month's rent. Shoes I knew for a fact he hadn't bought with his own money. Eleanor introduced him with this flourish, like she was showing off a piece of art she'd spent a fortune on. We were standing there in our front room in Greenwich, and she had this glow about her, the kind of look she used to give me back when we were newlyweds. It didn't take a genius to figure out why she was beaming. It wasn't that home renovation project she kept bringing up, and it sure wasn't some new hobby. It was him. See, I've been married to Eleanor for a long, long time. You don't spend decades sharing a life with a woman without picking up on her little tells. I know how her voice jumps up half a note when she's spinning a yarn about where she's been all afternoon. I know how she reaches up to touch her throat when she's worried she's about to get caught in a lie. She was doing both of those things right in front of my face, completely oblivious to the fact that I was reading her like an open book. Julian reached out to shake my hand. The move was smooth, practiced. He told me it was a real honor to be working with a man of my standing. Now, a phrase like that tells me everything I need to know about a person. Men in my position don't talk that way. Only the guys who want our money do. I took his hand and gripped it just a half-second longer than he expected. Just enough for the point to land. Then I turned a smile toward my wife. "Sounds like a plan, honey," I said. "Whatever you think is best." She leaned in and kissed my cheek, but her perfume smelled like a total stranger. Honestly, the affair didn't even shock me. Eleanor is a lot younger than I am. She's beautiful, and she's got too much time on her hands. That's a recipe for trouble in any neighborhood, no matter the zip code. What actually got me was the sheer contempt. She really believed I was so blinded by her that I wouldn't notice a guy half her age standing in my own living room with his hand on the small of her back. That night, I laid there in the dark next to her, listening to her fake being asleep. Her breathing was way too steady, too rhythmic. I've shared a bed with this woman long enough to know what she sounds like when she's actually out cold. And that wasn't it. I made my choice before the sun even started to peek through the curtains. I wasn't going to be that husband who loses his mind, breaks the china, or starts screaming and grabbing wrists. I've seen men do that. Men I've sat across from in boardrooms, and they always end up losing twice. They lose their dignity at home, and then they lose their reputation everywhere else. A man my age, with my name etched onto buildings all over the East Coast, doesn't have the luxury of acting like a child. So I decided on a different path. I was going to let her play her hand. I'd let her bring the kid around, let her blow my money on him, and let her believe she was the smartest person in the room. And then, when the timing was perfect, I'd show her what was actually in my hand. The secret to a long marriage isn't just trust. It's knowing exactly when to hold back what you know. I rolled over toward her side of the bed and placed my hand on her shoulder. Real gentle, just like I'd done 1,000 times before. She didn't budge. She kept up the act. So I shut my eyes and I played along. The next morning over breakfast, I told Eleanor I'd been thinking about her advice, about how I was stuck in the past and needed a fresh perspective. I told her she was absolutely right and that she should let Julian have free rein. New wardrobe, new furniture, the works. She lit up like a Christmas tree. She actually clapped her hands together like a kid and came around the table to peck me on the forehead. "Anything you want, sweetheart," I told her. "You're the one who picked him, and I trust your taste." She didn't even process that last part. She was already buried in her phone, sending him a text. For the next few weeks, Julian was at the house nearly every single day. He brought over fabric swatches and those fancy lookbooks. He even drove me into the city to see a tailor who fitted me for suits I had zero intention of wearing. He took me to some high-end showroom downtown and pointed out a sofa that cost more than my very first car. I just nodded, signed the checks, and let him spend my cash like it was water. Every time he handed me a receipt, I watched his face closely. Meanwhile, Eleanor was practically vibrating with excitement. She started humming around the kitchen again. She bought a new scent that she never wore for my benefit. A couple of times I came home in the middle of the day to find Julian's car sitting in our driveway, and both times she had a perfectly scripted excuse ready to go. I never questioned her. I never pushed. I just smiled and told them I was glad they were making such good progress. She thought she was winning the game. But the thing about a long marriage is that you know your own house better than your wife realizes. I know which floorboard makes a noise when you step on it. I know which closet door sticks. I knew that the guest room at the end of the hall got that perfect late afternoon sunlight, and I noticed Eleanor had started putting fresh linens on that bed every Tuesday, despite the fact that we hadn't had a visitor in months. I never went looking for the smoking gun. I want to make that clear. I never snooped through her phone or peeked at her messages. I didn't have to. The proof was right there in the air. I smelled her perfume on a pillow that wasn't ours. I saw a coffee cup on the back porch with lipstick on the rim that wasn't the color she wore when we went out. I even saw Julian's sunglasses sitting on my kitchen counter like he owned the place. What would you do in this situation? Would you have confronted them right then? Or would you keep playing it cool like I did? One Tuesday, I got home an hour earlier than I usually do. Eleanor's car was in the garage, and Julian's was in the driveway. The house was quiet, but it was that specific kind of quiet you get when two people are upstairs trying their hardest not to make a sound. I didn't run or try to be sneaky. I just dropped my keys onto the marble tray in the hall. That clatter of metal on stone echoed all the way up the stairs, just like it always does. I stood there for a long moment, just waiting. Then, I walked into my kitchen, poured a slow glass of water, and stood by the window drinking it. Upstairs, that silence shifted. It got heavy. I rinsed my glass, put it in the sink, grabbed my keys, and walked right back out the front door without ever raising my voice. I wanted them to know I'd been there. I wanted her to realize I'd heard that silence break. Let her sit with the uncertainty. That was all part of the strategy. I drove back to my office, sat at my desk, and watched the boats in the harbor for a while. I wasn't depressed, and I wasn't even mad. I felt like a man who finally sees the entire chessboard and knows exactly which piece to move next. A few days later, I made my move. During dinner at home, I brought up Julian. I told Eleanor the kid really had some talent. I told her he'd completely changed how I felt about my home, my clothes, and my life. I put a little extra weight on that word, life, and watched her face. She didn't even blink. She just smiled and said, "See? Didn't I tell you he was something special?" I told her I wanted to do something big for him, something that actually mattered. I mentioned I'd been looking at this incredible studio space in the downtown design district. Huge windows, prime corner spot, perfect for a young guy trying to make a name for himself. I told her I was ready to set him up there with a 5-year lease. Fully furnished, fully equipped, his very own business with his name on the door. Eleanor set her wine glass down very slowly. I watched her try to keep her composure, and for the first time since I've known her, I watched her fail. For a split second, I saw it, pure, unfiltered triumph, before she masked it back into a supportive wife smile. "Robert," she said, "that is incredibly generous. He's going to be over the moon." I told her I wanted it to be a surprise and that I'd handle the details personally. I told her not to breathe a word of it to him. She agreed immediately. Of course she did. In her head, the math was simple. Her husband was footing the bill for her lover's new studio. I figured she had it all mapped out. In her head, I was the bankroll and Julian, now set up, successful, and no longer tucked away like a shameful secret in her husband's house, would be all hers. She honestly thought she'd pulled off the ultimate win. I just leaned over, topped off her wine glass, and told her I loved her. 2 days later, I got Julian on the phone. I told him to come by my office, and I made it clear I wanted to see him alone. I told him we had some serious business to discuss, the kind of talk that changes a man's life. He showed up that afternoon looking like he'd already made it. He was sporting a navy blazer and a watch I'd never seen before, sitting across from me with his legs crossed and his chin high, acting like he owned the place. I had 2 items on the desk between us: a leather folder with the lease inside, and my phone, which was sitting right there in the open, recording every word. I told him I make a habit of recording business meetings and asked if he minded. He just shrugged and said, "No problem at all," with the air of a man who thought he was already my equal. I slid the folder his way and spelled out the terms. 5-year lease, prime real estate, fully furnished and equipped. His name was on every single page. I watched his hands shake just a little as he flipped through the paperwork. Then I gave him the catch. I told him that if he walked out of that office with the lease, he'd never speak to Eleanor again. No calls, no texts, not even a nod if they passed each other on the street. I had a single sheet of paper ready for him, a written promise signed and dated, stating he would cut all ties with her immediately and permanently. If he signed, the studio was his. If he didn't, he walked out with nothing but the clothes on his back. He didn't even blink. He didn't ask for time to think it over, and he didn't ask how Eleanor would feel. He just grabbed the pen and put his name on the line. After he signed, I kept my voice low and friendly. I asked him, "Won't you miss her, even just a bit?" He let out this little laugh, the kind of laugh guys use when they think they're sharing a man-to-man moment. He said, "Business comes first. Crushes, they come and go." He actually called my wife a crush, like she was some catchy tune he'd finally gotten sick of hearing. I thanked him for being straight with me, shook his hand, and told him my people would be in touch about the keys. He walked out clutching that leather folder like it was his firstborn child. I bet he was on the phone bragging to someone before he even reached the elevator. The second that door clicked shut, I picked up my phone and called the building owner. I told him to tear up the lease. He asked if I was certain about that, and I told him I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Then, I sat there and looked at that 41-minute recording. Every word he'd said about her, every shrug, every dismissive laugh. I emailed a copy to myself and locked the original in my safe. That evening, I went home and made Eleanor dinner, salmon, exactly the way she likes it. I poured her wine and asked about her day. She told me it was wonderful. I decided to wait one more day. I wanted her to feel completely secure, to wake up believing she had the husband, the lover, the house, and the future all lined up, only to have it vanish in a single conversation without me ever having to raise my voice. That Thursday, I walked in at 7 p.m. Eleanor was in the kitchen, barefoot in a silk robe, humming to herself. The whole house smelled like those expensive candles Julian had picked out. I poured a bourbon, sat down at the island, and asked her to join me. Then, very calmly, I told her I'd canceled the studio deal. The lease, the furniture, the whole thing was dead. She looked at me like I was speaking a language she didn't understand. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You promised that boy a future." I took out my phone, set it on the marble counter, and hit play. I watched her face crumble in real time. Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't take pleasure in it like some guy looking for a fight. It was more like watching a building you used to think was beautiful finally get demolished. There was a sad, heavy kind of dignity in it. She sat there and heard him laugh at her. She heard him call her a crush. She heard him trade her away in 3 seconds flat for an office space. When the recording stopped, she was dead still. She didn't scream. She just stared at the phone like it was a coiled snake. She finally looked up and asked, "Why are you doing this?" I looked her right in the eye for a long beat and said, "You traded everything we had for that. I just wanted you to see the receipt." I slid that signed promise across the counter. His handwriting, his signature, the date. She picked it up with 2 fingers like it was a piece of roadkill. I reminded her that the house was mine long before she showed up, and it would be mine after she left. I gave her until midnight to pack a bag. The rest of her stuff could be dealt with later in the week. I told her a car was waiting outside and I'd booked her a hotel room in her own name for 3 nights. After that, she was on her own. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I got up, put on my coat, and walked out the front door. I didn't slam it. I didn't have to. I left her sitting there holding a piece of paper that told her exactly what she was worth to the man she'd ruined our marriage for. I slept on the couch in my office that night. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't want to watch her pack. Some things a man just doesn't need to see. The next morning, I had the housekeeper change every door code before noon. I told my secretary to stop forwarding anything from Eleanor's number. Then I went to the harbor diner I visited for 20 years, ordered my usual eggs and black coffee, and read the paper like it was any other Friday morning. It was the most peaceful morning I'd had in a year. 3 months went by without a word. In a place like Greenwich, news travels fast, faster than most people realize. I never said a word to anyone about what happened, but Eleanor's world was small. People notice when one of their own goes missing. The charity boards she loved stopped calling. Her best friends stopped picking up. I heard the fallout the way men like me always do, sideways comments over coffee from partners whose wives knew someone who knew someone. She'd lost her standing without me ever saying a mean word about her. As for Julian, I heard he showed up downtown the same day Eleanor packed her bags, ready to take photos in front of his new empire. Of course, there was no lease. He called my office a dozen times and sent emails I never opened. Eventually, he got the hint. The fancy watch, the blazers, the lifestyle, none of it was ever really his. Last I heard, he'd crawled back to his mother's place in Jersey. Then, on a Tuesday in early fall, Eleanor sent me a message. It wasn't a plea or a sob story, just a short, professional note suggesting we meet at a coffee shop a town over to talk like adults. I almost deleted it. But then I changed my mind. I guess I just wanted to see what kind of play she'd come up with after all that time. When I pulled up to the coffee shop, she was already sitting there by the window, wearing a coat I'd picked out for her a couple of winters back. She looked put together, rested, even. She didn't bother standing up. She just motioned toward the empty chair across from her with that specific kind of confidence a woman has when she's still trying to pretend she owns half the table. She didn't waste any time. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said the way I'd ended things was brutal, but, in her eyes, understandable. She kept using phrases like, "we're both adults," to set the stage. She wasn't asking to move back into the marriage exactly as it was. She claimed she wasn't that naive. Instead, she pitched a quieter arrangement. The idea was that she'd return to the house in some capacity, maybe as a friend of the family or a hostess for the holidays. We'd be a united front for the public and the charity events. But behind closed doors, we'd live entirely separate lives. It's for both our sakes, she argued, to protect our reputations. She even slid her phone toward me, like she'd already typed up a rough draft of the terms. I didn't even reach for it. I just sat there, looking at her for a long, heavy minute. And it hit me right then. She still hadn't grasped the first thing about why I did what I did. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence hang between us until she started to look uncomfortable. Then, I said it real quiet, the way you'd explain something simple to a kid who just isn't getting it. "Eleanor," I said, "you still don't get it. I wasn't trying to save my reputation. I was trying to get away from you." That took the wind right out of her sails. Her mouth moved like she was trying to find a rebuttal, but nothing came out. I watched the light just drain out of her face. That version of her, the woman who'd strolled into my office with that boy behind her, so damn sure she was the one in control. She was finally gone. We both knew there was no coming back from that. I stood up, dropped a $20 bill on the table to cover her coffee, and didn't bother saying goodbye. Honestly, I didn't even recognize the woman sitting there anymore. I walked out into the parking lot, and the autumn air felt cold, sharp, and incredibly clean. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute, just watching my breath fog up the glass. Then I drove back toward Greenwich. I didn't go straight home, though. I pulled into that same harbor diner where I'd eaten the morning after she left. I sat in the same booth by the window, ordered my usual eggs and black coffee, and just breathed. The waitress called me by my name, and a guy at the next table gave me that silent nod men give when they recognize a kindred spirit. I took my time, read the news, and paid the bill in cash. Then I stepped back out into the afternoon, ready to get back to the business of being a man who lives in his own house, on his own terms, with nobody's hand on his back but his own. That was about 18 months ago. Eleanor's down in Florida now. A mutual friend mentioned she's renting a place near her sister and hasn't set foot in Greenwich since the split. As for Julian, he never showed his face again. And that's the long and short of it. I appreciate you sticking around to hear the end of the tale. If you liked how this turned out, hit that subscribe button. I've got plenty more stories like this one to tell.